August the 13th, 1944, when I saw South Park from the top of Kenosha, I thought I had died and gone to heaven. I never saw any place so beautiful.
There is a uniqueness about the South Park region. It is a timeless place where 30 million years ago, ash from volcanoes covered and preserved tropical trees. It is a place where plants unique to this area flourish and wildlife abounds. Vast open grasslands and rare wetlands are surrounded by majestic mountains. While only a short distance from the bustling life of the Front Range cities, over 1,800 square miles of natural beauty defies change but welcomes those who can appreciate what it has to offer. This is rugged Colorado. This is the South Park National Heritage Area. The expansive views and unlimited beauty mask an underlying harshness that created this area. Volcanoes, earthquakes, and the thunder of prehistoric animals dominated South Park. As the evolution of the land began millions of years ago, geological changes formed the mountain ranges and the valley that sits between them.
South Park is an intermountain basin. It is a large intermountain basin. It is almost square in nature, with the east-west dimensions being about 40 miles and the north-south dimensions about 50 miles.
South Park now lies 2 miles above sea level, but at one time was an inland sea.
100 million years ago, there'd be no volcanoes. To the east, you got an ocean you can't see across, and swamps behind the lagoon. If you walked along this ridge far enough, I suspect you'd find at some time some dinosaur footprints in that, because this was a logical locality for them.
In contrast, glaciers also once covered the area. The South Park Basin is surrounded by mountain peaks that can reach over 14,000 feet in elevation. This is where the glaciers form their headwaters.
The mountains along the west side are the oldest. They were formed about 72 million years ago. There were many different periods of glaciation. Some people think there are as many as 18 of them in the last 2 million years. The one that Fairplace sits on was dated at 140,000 years ago. So what you see now is nothing like what it was back 72 million years ago.
High winds, cold, and storms continue to challenge the high-altitude tundra. Bristlecone pines have stood defiantly for centuries, twisting but never yielding to the winds, resulting in gnarly shapes. They speak to the tenacity of the people, animals, and alpine plants that live at this high altitude. For more than 10,000 years, people have been drawn to this rare land to enjoy the cool summers. The early native people would migrate to South Park in the summer to hunt, fish, and to gather plants and salt. The early white trappers called the area Bayou Salado, referring to the salt marshes they found here. The French called the area Park, which meant a place where there is an abundance of game animals. When the fierce winds and snows of winter began to blow, people wisely left for warmer climates. Even the mountain men and hunters collected their furs and pelts and left the South Park before the snows got too deep.
The 1830s, there were very, very few white men in this area, so you were quite a novelty to the Indians. We were actually out here in the West on a trapping expedition for 6 to 8 months. We would trap until it started getting really cold, and then the wagons would all start going back east, and that's where the money was. There was a lot of trade going on between the trappers and the Indians. We would bring glass beads, mirrors, knives, hatchets. They really loved that. They did not have steel. When we introduced steel knives and hatchets to them, very great trade items. A lot of times they also trapped. We would trade for buffalo robes, moccasins, different hides, and so the trade was good with the Indians. The number one thing would be the rifle, which takes a rock to make it shoot, a flintlock. This is definitely the tools of the trade. As trappers, we would have traps, steel traps, rifles, shot, powder, very important things. Then after that, everything else was hacked out of the wilderness and improvised. There were no fire irons because that stuff was too heavy. We traveled as light as possible.
There were probably no more than a dozen trappers at any given time trapping out the Bayou Salado, this area. Bayou Salado means the salt marsh, and down where what is presently Antero Reservoir is a very salty area. And the buffalo would naturally congregate here as well. So not only did we have trappers, but we had fur hunters around here that were, focused on buffalo as well as beaver.
When the mountain men, the trappers, the long hunters all started going west, that had to be an awesome time to top the top of a mountain, look down, and see something for the first time in a white man's absolute history. The beavers back east were being trapped out, so all of a sudden the trappers started moving into Colorado, definitely in Park County because of the terrain, the landscape area. There were a lot of beaver then.
A lot of these guys, if they were able to survive, nobody got rich doing this. Nobody ever really made any significant money. But that's just the thing. Back then, money meant nothing to these guys. Paper money, gold money was worthless. It was more important to have a horse, to have a rifle.
These gentlemen, most of them, I want to say 80% did not live past the age of 30 years old. The work, it was very, very extremely hard work. You were wet, you were cold continuously. Everything from pneumonia and tuberculosis were probably two of the biggest killers. A lot of people think, oh no, the Indians did it. No, actually, it was literally the work.
Through time, great turmoil below the surface lined the very heart of these towering mountains with gold, silver, and dazzling minerals and gemstones. The formation was referred to as the Mineral Belt, which extended for hundreds of miles throughout the Rockies. As the cries of gold echoed back east, the area was soon flooded with wagon loads of people looking to get rich. Miners panned for gold or diverted the rivers, which is known as placer or hydraulic mining.
The first gold strike was up Boreas Pass at the headwaters of the Terrial. And I believe that was the Liebolt mine was the first strike. And it was a good strike, but no one ever found his cache of gold after he died.
The deeper riches of hard rock mines and the mills that supported them were soon seen on the horizons.
The structure behind us here is the Paris Mill, built in 1894, and it was built to process the ore from the Paris mine that's up above on the peak up there. And it has three different processing methods. There's a stamp mill, a ball mill, and then it had concentrating tables. So it was quite a large operation in its time. It was a really hard life up here. The elevation up here alone at 2 miles above sea level, we have the highest mine in North America at the top of Mount Lincoln, which is the present Help, and it's 14,157 feet. I've read that it was an 8-hour foot trip from Alma up to Mount Lincoln, and of course at the end of that day the miners couldn't work. I'm sure they had to just go to sleep that night and then work the next day.
We had a lot of mines going back then, up Buckskin, up Sacramento, up on Bras, Lincoln. One of the big producers was the Ling Mine on North Star Mountain. Beautiful ore, rhodochrosite up in the Sweet Home mine. Most everybody was in some way involved with mining.
Well, in Buckskin Gulch here, it was primarily gold, although there was some silver and other minerals. Actually, at the turn of the century in the 1900s, they found tungsten up here, and they literally picked it up off the ground, if you can imagine. And so they mined that for a while up here, and that was kind of a second boom that the Buckskin Gulch had. But on Mount Bras, Cameron, and Lincoln was primarily silver, and that was a huge silver boom. You know, one of my mining friends has hand-drawn with his brother a mining claim map of this area, which extends over into Horseshoe Gulch and Mosquito Gulch, as well as up to Mount Lincoln. Hundreds, thousands of mines, claims are on this map. It was amazing how much was here.
It wasn't long before the giant dredge boats were floating on the rivers. Mining was soon a prosperous industry in South Park.
And then, of course, as the standard of living and the price of living went up and the price of gold stayed the same, then mining just sort of petered out. When I was growing up, everything was declining. Alma was growing smaller, Fairplay was growing smaller. But when mining kind of went toes up, dear little Alma went the same. One old-timer described Alma as being a graveyard with electric lights.
However, mining wasn't for everyone. Some of the new residents looked across the large grassy plains and decided it would be a perfect place to raise cattle and sheep. The ranchers became a food supplier for the miners and the businesses that supported them. As it turned out, the high-altitude hay raised in South Park gained a world-class reputation. Ranching continues in South Park, but not without some interesting high-altitude challenges.
It's the growing season. It's a harsh winter up at this altitude. It can get as low as 60 below. Last winter it was 45 below, and it gets a little frosty out here. You have to watch out for high-altitude sickness with the cattle. They acclimate with breeding, and there's also testing of your bulls and your cattle to see if they are compatible with high altitude. But you can breed it out. You know, grass is at a premium up here. Well, there's only one cutting here, and it's a different grass. It's a saline grass. We run along the Salt Creek, and so there's a lot of alkaline and saline grasses up at this altitude. The Tsar of Russia supposedly imported the hay for his horses. He was so impressed with it when he was over here on his train car, you know, hunting buffalo. You can see on the ground, it looks like a high mineral content. You know, the tundra is very tender and it grows very short. It doesn't look like much grass, but that short grass has a lot of protein in it for the cattle. They enjoy it. They prefer the short grass over the tall grass. It's just taking care of animals and being a good steward of the land. It seems like the last standing example of the way it was in the late 1800s, you know, after the Civil War and what was going on back then. It's a visual reference to it. And that's why it's important to maintain it and keep it operating as a working ranch. And it's what made us Americans, is this journey out into the West. So it'd be a shame to see it disappear, and it slowly is getting eaten up.
A gentleman by the name of Charles Hall and Mary Nye, they traveled together on the same wagon train in 1858 across the states and into the territory. Just a few years later, after coming to this area, they wed and homesteaded this ranch in 1862. The main function of the ranch was for the procurement of the salt from the natural salt spring, and that went on for about 10 years successfully until the railroads came in the early 70s and brought in a cheaper way of getting the salt. They used a technology called pan and kettle. The longest part, where the chimney was on the end, housed a 100-foot stove, and then the kettles were set on top of that, and they boiled down the salt water.
Most specifically, we're at the source of where the salt comes up for us in the form of salt water. What we do know is there were at some point seas, and the seas are no more and have evaporated, but what's left of the sea salt now comes up from underground, and this is what we have.
One of the things that makes it most special is how it hasn't changed much over the years. Because I think it speaks without words, and a person can develop a reality with past generations without having to say much.
Towns began to spring up to provide the infrastructure needed for the miners and ranchers. There were also new business opportunities which focused on providing supplies and services. Blacksmith shops, banks, grocery stores, saloons, and even churches began to prosper. The towns were a place to raise families and gather as a community.
Well, the Hoffmans were early pioneers to the district. They came here at Lou and August with their parents in 1876 during the silver rush to the Rockies. Both men were actually giants for their day and age, standing well over 6 foot tall. They made wonderful blacksmiths. They were miners. They had hard lives. You had to be tough. Many times they thought they struck it rich mining, and it didn't work out. The blacksmith was a man of many talents. He not only worked with horses and oxen, but he did all of the iron work for the mines. If an ore bucket needed repaired, he did it. If drill steel had to be sharpened, he did it. If a wagon had a broken wheel, he was the man who fixed the wheel. He was the wheelwright. He was truly a jack of all trades, very talented. This is maybe where the guys could dabble in just a little bit of gossip about what mine was really going to strike it rich or which one was going to go defunct. We had a really good school. It's like having a private tutor when there were only 7 in your class. The teacher was always there for you. And so we came out with really a plus when we went into high school.
However, the communities were isolated from each other. Transportation around the many miles of Park County was slow. New roads were built to accommodate freight haulers and stagecoaches, while many miners relied on burro trains. It wasn't until the arrival of the railroad that the South Park was really connected to the outside world. The railroad provided a method for the miners to ship their ore for processing, and the ranchers could ship the cattle they raised to markets hundreds of miles away.
The railroads really fostered or enabled the development of the South Park area. People moving, freight coming in and out, supplies coming in and out, ore going back down to Denver to be processed, and it really speeded up development. Initially, the Denver, South Park, and Pacific was narrow gauge. And one of the reasons that they built in narrow gauge was because of the economy of it. The engines and the trains and the track were all smaller and lighter. They were cheaper to buy and actually more conducive to steep grades and tight turns in the mountains. The challenge was keeping the train on the tracks, not losing it going downhill. The grades are steep. Generally they were limited to 4%, which in modern railroads 1.5% is a steep grade. It really limited how much you could pull up a hill. And going downhill, there's always the danger of a runaway, and that's just multiplied by ice and snow on the rails. They came up with this wonderful piece of machinery called the Leslie Rotary, and it was just a big circular wheel with a lot of blades on it that would throw snow. It had a steam engine boiler behind the wheel just to drive the wheel. The thing actually wasn't propelled by itself. It took several engines to push this thing. And it did a wonderful job. Took the place literally of hundreds of men. And then we've seen many pictures of lots and lots of people with shovels. And it's amazing. Sometimes they're clearing 20-foot deep snow. Basically, they stopped wherever the towns were, because there's always people and materials that need to come and go, and occasionally out in the middle of nowhere. So basically, the railroad just said, what's the need? And that's where we'll stop.
They came, the gold miners, then the train came. The Italians had named this Como, and that's how it began.
There were trains going at least 10 per day, especially in the prime time from about 1890 to 1910. 10 trains a day at least, but sometimes up to 26 trains. Each train had its own separate whistle that the engineers could tweak, so when they were coming into town, their family knew that they were coming in.
Tourism, which had been around since the late 1860s, grew into a new industry as people from Denver came on the train to experience the wildflowers and cool air of South Park.
The railroad promoted heavily the sites and whatnot. The South Park also ran along the Platte River, and they emphasized fishing.
Como was a bustling little town when the train was here. I understand people used to come on vacation. They'd take the train. They enjoyed the wildflowers of South Park. A little rambunctious, this little town, full of saloons, brothels. Apparently there was the revenuers would come up from the city on the train, and they had a whistle because of church camp, and even at the roundhouse they had moonshine going. And they would blow a certain whistle to warn everyone in Como to hide the shine. The revenuers were on the train. So this gives you an idea of what kind of town it was.
Well, this building is very much a work in progress. The room we're in at the moment is the waiting room. And when the building was built originally in 1879, we're fairly sure that the station agent had his office over here behind me. We have a photograph from 1883 that we can date pretty clearly, and it shows the building as it is now. When the roundhouse was built, when they started building over Boreas Pass to Leadville, that's when Como became an important railroad town. It was the biggest railroad facility outside of Denver.
So they built this roundhouse here of stone, basically a garage for locomotives to be serviced. The length of time a locomotive would spend in one of the bays depended on what it needed. Typically a locomotive would come in at the end of the day and they'd put it in the barn at night and basically just clean it up, keep the fire going, oil it all around, get it lubricated up, and get it ready for the next day's work. They'd keep a fire in it all night so it wouldn't go cold, and they'd have to start the fire from scratch. Bring it out the next day and would go to work. Whatever the locomotive needed, they would do, and the bigger jobs could take several weeks before they were finished. This is the turntable itself, and the way it worked is it pivoted in the middle, and there was a rail that went around these stone blocks, and they would spike this rail, it's a guide rail, on the perimeter of the pit. So most of the weight was on the pivot point in the middle, but also there was a wheel on each end, and there was what they called a Johnson bar. And it came out here about 8 or 10 feet, and it was a big, like an oak beam. And they would just lean into it, and they'd be able to push this thing around. Most of the weight was on the bearing in the middle. And 2 guys, 4 would be a luxury, but 1 guy in each end could easily push this thing around. So they would spin it around to line it up with one of the tracks into the roundhouse. Again, lock it in place once they got it aligned, and then the locomotive would release its brake and steam into the roundhouse.
The Pacific Hotel was the hotel division of the Union Pacific, and this was the only narrow gauge hotel that they had. Now, when this building was built, there were 20 trains a day coming past here, and the platform extended 20 feet at its most from the track. So it would have been quite a noisy building, and I'm sure it vibrated a bit as the trains rumbled past.
In 1937, the railroad service ended in Park County. In addition, gas rationing during World War II kept a lot of people home. Towns like Como became ghost towns.
Well, they pulled the train tracks. Apparently, the trains were owned by one big conglomerate group. Very political. South Park Loop that came through here was not holding its own. It wasn't making enough money, so they discontinued it. When they discontinued it, they took the tracks with them. And in 1938, we were a ghost town.
However, Park County regained popularity as sports enthusiasts discovered the recreational opportunities.
When you drive around Park County, you get a feeling of the immenseness of the West and the distances and the space between people. You're looking at real cowboys out there really ranching. It's a genuine Colorado experience. This is the real thing. It's a beautiful place, and then you've got all these wonderful activities you can do here too, like fly fishing or mountain biking or skiing, and cross-country skiing in Park County is incredible.
People always came to Park County seeking its abundant resources. Now, mountain bikers race along what were once remote burro trails. Gold medal trout streams attract fly fishermen.
Fly fishing here is incredible. It's just a beautiful place to be. If you don't catch a fish, it really doesn't matter because you're having such a good time anyway, but quite often you'll catch quite a few fish. So.
The preservation of historic mines, towns, depots, and ranches result in heritage tour exploration. There are countless possibilities to hike, camp, climb, hunt, bike, and fish. Whether you are on horseback, in an off-highway vehicle, or in your car, there is a photo opportunity waiting everywhere.
My aunt escorted me at the age of 13 from New Mexico, eastern New Mexico, by train. We came to Denver, and we were picked up by my stepfather. And when we topped Kenosha Pass and I looked out over all those beautiful green meadows and the mountains, I thought, I'm going to spend the rest of my life here. And I'm working on it. I'm now 81, and I'm still working on it.
The preservation and enjoyment of these natural and cultural riches is the reason that Congress designated the South Park as a National Heritage Area. Please experience and explore the region while remembering to preserve these resources for the future. Thank you.